Day we buried my wife of 38 years, my son came home with us, sat at the kitchen table, and told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Not asked, told. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the blinds. The same kitchen where Carol had made coffee every single morning since 1986. The same table where we'd helped our kids with homework. Where we'd argued about nothing and laughed about everything. And my son Daniel, sitting across from me in his good funeral clothes, hands folded like he was closing a business deal. "Dad, we've talked about this," he said. "The house is in Mum's name. She left it to me in the will." I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, our neighbor Frank was mowing his lawn. I could hear the engine droning through the window glass. "Your mother never told me that," I finally said. He looked down at the table. "She updated her will 2 years ago. The attorney can confirm everything." That was it. That was the whole conversation. My wife wasn't cold in the ground, and I was being given 30 days to vacate the home I had paid the mortgage on for over 3 decades. I want to be fair to Daniel. Or I want to try. He wasn't always like this. When he was 12, he cried for an hour because he accidentally hit a bird with his bicycle. He used to call his mother every Sunday without fail. I don't know exactly when that version of my son disappeared, or whether the man who replaced him had always been waiting underneath. I just know that sometime after he married Renata, something shifted. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Renata. I should talk about Renata. She's not a villain in a movie. She doesn't twirl a cape. She's just a woman who grew up without much, decided she deserved more than the world had given her, and married my son as part of the plan to get it. I understood that about her within the first year. Carol understood it within the first month. My wife was always smarter than me about people. "She's counting things," Carol told me once. Maybe 4 years into the marriage. We were lying in bed, whispering the way you do when something worries you. But you don't want to make it real by saying it too loud. She's always counting. The house. Your retirement. What we have. She's filing it away. I told Carol she was being uncharitable. She gave me the look she'd been giving me for 30-odd years. Patient, a little sad, entirely certain she was right. She was right. After Carol's diagnosis, things moved fast in ways I didn't notice until later. Daniel and Renata started coming around more, helping with groceries, driving Carol to appointments. I was grateful. I told friends how grateful I was. I bragged about my son, the good one, the one who showed up. What I didn't see, what I was too exhausted and too scared to see, was that Renata had started having long, quiet conversations with Carol, alone. Just the two of them, while I sat in the waiting room at the oncology center flipping through magazines I wasn't reading. I didn't know what they talked about. Not then. Carol died on a Tuesday in October. Maple leaves were coming down all over the front yard, and the hospice nurse, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, who had been kinder to us than I can adequately describe, held Carol's hand at the end. I held the other one. Daniel was there. Renata was in the hallway. The funeral was on Friday. By Sunday, my son was sitting at my kitchen table telling me I had 30 days. I called an attorney friend, a man named Phil who'd done some work for me years ago when I was still running the print shop. Phil pulled up the will Carol had filed, and it was exactly as Daniel said. The house had been transferred to Daniel's name. The joint checking account, which I'd assumed would simply continue as mine, had a transfer on death designation to Daniel as well. I had my pension, my social security, my truck, the clothes in the closet. "Walter," Phil said, "that's my name, Walter. I want you to hear this carefully. Did Carol ever discuss this with you, any of it?" "No," I said. "Never." He was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual." I didn't know what to do with that word at the time. Unusual. I turned it over for days while I packed boxes and tried to figure out where I was going to go. My daughter lived in Phoenix. I hadn't mentioned her yet. I should. Her name is Brenda. She's 4 years younger than Daniel, and she and Carol were close in a way that Daniel and I never quite achieved with anyone. Brenda called me the day after the funeral. She called me every day after that. She wanted me to come to Phoenix immediately. "Dad, something is wrong," she kept saying. "Mom would never have done this, not without telling you, not without talking to you first." I told her people did strange things when they were sick. That maybe Carol had wanted to protect the house. I was defending decisions my wife had made that made no sense. Because the alternative, the thing Brenda was circling around and wouldn't say directly, was too big to look at straight. I packed for 3 weeks. I was methodical about it, the way you get when you don't know what else to be. I packed Carol's kitchen things into boxes and labeled them because I didn't know what else to do with them. I packed the photo albums, the Christmas ornaments we'd accumulated over 40 years, each one with a little story attached. The ceramic angel from our first Christmas in that apartment in Cincinnati, the wooden sled my mother had painted with our names, the terrible glitter star Brenda had made in 2nd grade that Carol had refused to throw away for 3 decades. 3 days before I had to be out, I was in the garage going through the last of the boxes Carol had stored on the metal shelving along the back wall. She'd been the family archivist, years of documents, the kids' old school papers, tax returns going back to 1994. I was taking down boxes and stacking them near the door, and behind the last row, pushed back against the concrete wall, I found something that didn't belong. It was a small fireproof safe, gray, with a combination dial, about the size of a shoebox. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. I had never seen it before in my life. I tried every combination I could think of. Carol's birthday, my birthday, our anniversary, the kids' birthdays. Nothing worked. I called Brenda. "Did Mum ever mention a safe to you?" I asked. A pause. "No." "But Dad, call Phil. Call him today." Phil told me to bring it to his office without mentioning it to Daniel. I drove over that afternoon with the safe in a canvas bag on the passenger seat. Phil knew a locksmith who could open it without damaging the contents. We sat in his conference room and waited while a man named Terry worked on the dial for about 20 minutes, and then it clicked open. Inside, there was an envelope with my name on it, in Carol's handwriting, and a USB drive, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a letter to Phil specifically, dated 14 months before Carol died, asking him to notarize it and keep a copy in his files, which he'd had no idea was there until I handed it to him and he went pale. "She mailed this to me," he said quietly, turning it over. "I would have filed it. Lord Walter, I would have filed it and never connected it to you." I opened my envelope first, because I needed to hear Carol's voice before I could process anything else, even if it was her written voice, even if it was words on paper. "Walter," she wrote, "I need you to read this slowly, and I need you to believe me, even when it's hard to believe. Renata has been talking to me about the will since before my diagnosis. I thought at first she was just being practical, the way young people are now about money and property, and I tried not to hold it against her. But she kept coming back to it. And after I got sick, the conversations changed. She told me you'd been unfaithful. She showed me messages. I don't know where she got them, or whether they were real. But Walter, I want you to know that in my bones, I didn't believe her. I want you to know that. But she was very good at what she was doing. And I was very sick. And I was scared. She told me that if I didn't update the will, Daniel would fight you for the house after I was gone, and it would get ugly, and the lawyers would take everything. She said updating it was the only way to protect Daniel. She made it sound like it was for him. I changed the will because I was frightened, and I wasn't thinking clearly, and I'm so sorry. By the time I understood what had happened, I didn't have the strength to fight it legally. So I did what I could. The USB has everything. Watch it and then call Phil. He has a letter that will explain the rest. I set the letter down on the conference table. Phil handed me a box of tissues without saying anything. Terry the locksmith had quietly left the room. I plugged the USB into Phil's laptop. There were 11 video files. Carol had recorded them on her phone over the last 8 months of her life. Some were short, 2 or 3 minutes. Some were 40 minutes long. She was in the bedroom in most of them, sitting up in bed with the reading lamp on. She looked tired. She looked like herself. In the first video, she explained everything she'd written in the letter, but in full, every conversation with Renata, every pressure point, every piece of the manipulation that she'd slowly recognized for what it was. She was methodical. She kept notes on her phone throughout, and she read from them directly. In the second video, she showed her phone screen and scrolled through a text conversation with Renata that went back almost 2 years. The messages were careful. Renata was careful. But across 2 years, the pattern was unmistakable. Questions about the house value, questions about the retirement accounts, gentle suggestions about the will, references to Daniel's future security. And then, after Carol's diagnosis, the messages changed in tone. More urgent, more frequent. In the third video, Carol cried. She apologized to me directly, looking straight into the camera, and said she was sorry for not trusting me enough to tell me, and that her fear had made her do something she knew was wrong, and that she loved me, and that she was trying to fix it, the only way she still could. I couldn't watch that one all the way through. Not in Phil's office, not yet. The other videos included Carol on the phone. She'd recorded her own calls, something I didn't know she knew how to do, with Renata, with Daniel, and once with an attorney who was not Phil, an attorney Renata had recommended who had helped draft the new will. In those calls, Renata's voice was different from the version I'd known at family dinners, harder, more specific about numbers. Phil's letter from Carol outlined what she was requesting, that Phil retain copies of all the videos, that he be prepared to serve as a witness if Walter ever needed to contest the will, and that he make contact with an estate litigation attorney she'd already researched and listed by name. We sat in Phil's conference room for 3 hours that afternoon, going through everything. I moved into Brenda's guest room in Phoenix 2 weeks later. I drove the truck and I cried somewhere in New Mexico. Pulled over on the side of I-10 with the engine running and let myself cry in a way I hadn't since the hospital. Then I dried my face and drove the rest of the way. Phil began working with the estate litigation attorney, whose name was Marguerite, and who had the calm, organized energy of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. She told me the case was strong. She also told me it would take time. It took 14 months. I won't walk through every step because honestly some of it blurs together. The depositions, the document requests, the hearings. What I will tell you is that when Renata's attorney watched the 11 videos for the first time, there was a recess requested immediately afterward. And when the text messages were introduced, Daniel, who had been sitting at the other table with his arms crossed and his face hard, went very still. The will was contested on the grounds of undue influence. In the state where we lived, that's a recognized legal claim, and what Carol had documented, the sustained, calculated pressure applied to a terminally ill woman, was textbook. The original will, the one Carol had written before Renata came into her life, was entered into evidence. In it, Carol had left the house to me, outright, with the understanding that upon my death it would pass equally to Daniel and Brenda. The judge reinstated the original will. The house came back to me. The joint account. Daniel had already spent a significant portion of it, which was its own separate proceeding, was partially recovered with interest. Renata didn't attend the final hearing. Daniel did. He sat across the room from me and I watched him absorb what his wife had done, what he'd been willing to do alongside her, what it had cost all of us. And I watched something move across his face that I hadn't seen there in years. I don't know what to call it exactly. Recognition, maybe. Grief. He called me 2 weeks after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. The third time I picked up. He didn't make excuses. I'll give him that. He said he'd known something was off, and he'd told himself it wasn't his business, and that he was ashamed, and that he understood if I was done with him. I told him I wasn't done with him, but that things were going to be different. He said okay. We've had dinner twice since then, just the two of us, no Renata. I don't know what his marriage looks like now from the inside. I don't ask. What I know is that my son looked at me over a plate of barbecue last spring and said, She showed me those text messages too. About you cheating on Mum. I believed them, Dad, and I'm sorry. I told him his mother hadn't believed them. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere important. I sold the house in the end. I couldn't go back to living in it the way I'd hoped I could. Too many things had happened inside those walls, and some of them, the good ones, the 38 years of them, I wanted to keep somewhere safe in my memory, without having to walk past the kitchen table every day and think about that Sunday afternoon in October. I sold it and bought a smaller place in Phoenix, 10 minutes from Brenda, with a garage big enough for a workshop where I've been slowly getting back into woodworking for the first time since I was in my 30s. Brenda comes over on Sundays. Sometimes she brings her kids, my grandchildren, who are 7 and 10 and absolutely chaotic in the best possible way. We have lunch. We sit in the backyard if the weather's good. I've put one thing on the wall of the workshop. It's not one of the videos. I couldn't frame a video, but I printed out the first line of Carol's letter, the one she wrote to me, in a clean, simple font, and I had it matted and framed at a shop downtown. Walter, I need you to read this slowly, and I need you to believe me even when it's hard to believe. I read it every morning before I start work. I believe her. I always did. I think about Renata sometimes. Not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of tired clarity. She was smart. She was patient. She played a long game and she played it well, and for a while it worked. What she didn't account for was that Carol was smarter and more patient and had been playing an entirely different game that Renata never even knew was on the table. That's the thing about people who operate without a conscience. They tend to assume everyone else does too. They read the world as a transaction, and they can't quite imagine that someone might be watching them, not to strike back, but simply to protect the people they love. Carol didn't set up those videos because she wanted revenge. She set them up because she wanted me to be okay. That distinction matters to me more than I can explain. I've turned the whole story over in my mind more times than I can count. The part that used to keep me up at night was not what Renata did. It was what Daniel did, or didn't do. He had doubts, he told me later. He knew something felt off, and he chose to look away because looking away was easier and more profitable than looking straight at it. That's its own kind of failure, different from Renata's but connected to it. The choice to not know when some part of you already does, that costs you something. It cost Daniel 2 years of his father's trust, and I suspect a great deal more that he hasn't told me about. What I've come to believe, standing in my workshop in Phoenix on a Tuesday morning, is that the 3 things that actually hold a life together are simpler than anyone makes them sound. The first is doing right by people even when nobody's watching, and there's no immediate reward for it. Carol did that for 38 years, and then she did it from a hospital bed with a phone she could barely hold. The second is thinking clearly, especially when fear is loudest. Fear is what Renata used against Carol, and it worked for a while because fear is powerful. But Carol's mind was still her own, and she used it. She researched attorneys. She kept records. She thought several moves ahead while she was dying, and that kind of clear-eyed thinking is what saved everything. The third is simply not quitting. I packed boxes in that garage like a man who'd already lost. I drove to Phoenix feeling hollowed out. But I made the calls, sat in the conference rooms, answered the questions, and waited 14 months for a judge to say what Carol had already put into motion. None of those things are extraordinary. That's what I want to say. Carol wasn't extraordinary, or she was, but not in a way that was separate from ordinary daily life. She was just a woman who paid attention, told the truth, and refused to let fear be the last word. I have a workshop now. I make things out of wood. Small things, mostly. Boxes and frames and a rocking chair I've been working on for Brenda's porch. There's something about working with your hands that brings you back to yourself. You measure twice. You cut once. The mistakes are real, and so is the thing you build. I read Carol's first line every morning before I start. I'm still reading slowly. I still believe her.